It is a bit of an homage to the diplomatic service, because I think it's this career that in many senses hasn't changed over hundreds of years. It can be tough to be a diplomat, to be moving countries every few years, and new languages, new people, new cultures. And they do this for their whole professional careers with their families in tow.
I'm Michael Tamblyn. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is Eliza Reid, author of the novel Death on the Island. It's a mystery set on a remote island in Iceland, where a dinner party of diplomats turns fatal for the Deputy Ambassador of Canada. And it just so happens that the elements of this story, Iceland, diplomacy, the perils of being a Canadian out in the world, these are all things that Ottawa-born Eliza Reid knows well from the 8 years she spent as the First Lady of Iceland. Eliza Reid, welcome to Kobo.
Thanks for having me.
We have a couple of great books to talk about, and I promise we are going to dig into them. I confess that I almost started this interview with the question, growing up on a hobby farm in the Ottawa Valley, did you ever imagine that you would one day become First Lady of Iceland? Because that's a question you get a lot.
I do get that question a lot, and it always makes me laugh a little bit because, of course, growing up on a hobby farm in the Ottawa Valley, I hardly knew of the existence of Iceland, much less that I would end up living there, much less that I would end up married to the head of state of the country.
What I'm more interested in is that experience of landing in a new country. And I think many of us imagine packing up and moving to a totally new place. The thing that so often stops us is all of those fears, the fear of a new language, of new customs, not knowing the rules, not having friends. Can you tell me about what those first few years were like when you as a Canadian landed in Iceland for the first time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I sort of got there through a circuitous route because I lived in England for 5 years before then. So in that sense, I had experience living outside of my home country for a number of years, even though the same language is spoken there, and perhaps Canadians are more familiar with England than with Iceland in terms of living there. And then I fell in love with this man from Iceland when we were in graduate school in England. And so the reason that I moved to Iceland, I always say the reason I moved was for love, but I wanted to stay for me. And it was always important to me that, you know, when you meet in a third country, in our situation, England, and you choose to go to one or the other country, it's always going to be sort of an uneven dynamic, if you know what I mean.
Someone has to make the bigger choice.
Right, exactly. You know, someone has made that sacrifice, and you can never kind of use that. You know, you can't say, well, I don't want to load the dishwasher tonight because I moved here for you.
I would totally use that.
I think that's not good for a healthy relationship.
Probably
frankly. No. And, so, you know, we decided anyway that we wanted to build a life in Iceland. And even though I moved there because of my now husband, as I said, I wanted to stay for me, which meant building my own life there. And that meant finding a job that I enjoyed, that sort of matched my experience and what I was interested in doing. It meant learning the language. It meant having my own group of friends. And as you say, those things are hard to do and can be very discouraging. And I think that I went with the approach of saying, I'm not moving here to see how it goes. I'm moving here to build a life here. And if I want to build a happy life here, that's up to me to do it. And I think when I went with that approach, it sort of stopped me, you know, if the weather got bad or I didn't find a job that I wanted, or, you know, kept declining the grammar wrong, that I wouldn't quit, that quitting wasn't an option.
The Icelandic language is notoriously difficult. I think it's safe to say. Not easy, at least. How did you take that on as a project?
Well, I started taking lessons right away. First, you know, even before I moved to Iceland, I had, this shows you how old I am, a CD-ROM for the computer. So I learned phrases like, where's the train station? And there are no trains in Iceland. And where's the beach? And again, it's by the Arctic Circle. So they maybe weren't the most practical things, but I did kind of get a sense of how different letters were pronounced and how the grammar worked. And then once I moved there, I took a few Icelandic classes at the School for Continuing Education at the University of Iceland. And then I just tried to start speaking. And to me, the most challenging part, because Icelanders generally speak very good English. So you can live in Iceland forever and never learn a single word if you speak good English. And that wasn't really what I wanted. So the hardest part was the phase where I had learned enough to kind of carry on a little bit of small talk, to do some things, but I was still communicating with people whose English was better than my Icelandic. And I would have to say, no, we have to keep this conversation going in Icelandic, because otherwise I would never go through that phase.
It feels like you would need like a pin or a shirt or something to say, please keep speaking to me in Icelandic.
Well, I would go in effectively and I would say, hello, I am learning Icelandic. Can I have, and I always said I am learning Icelandic first, so people wouldn't switch. And the other thing, if you have any listeners out there who are trying to learn Icelandic, they may know that the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 all decline based on the case and the gender of what you're ordering. And so you always need to get at least 5 of something, because that doesn't decline. So I'd go and I'd be like, I would like 5 donuts, please.
This is my French 2 baguette.
Right.
Same thing. Tell me a bit about the career that you constructed for yourself there before you took on other official duties.
Yeah. So, because my husband didn't become president until 13 years after we had moved to Iceland on his first foray into public office. So I was building this life. I had worked in sort of sales and marketing for an international company in the UK. And that's what I did for the first year after I moved to Iceland. I was really lucky to see a job advertised in the paper, which usually it's done through contacts in Iceland. And then I lost my job after a year. It was a small startup, and these things happen. And anyone out there who has also experienced getting laid off from their job, it's not the funnest experience in the world at all. And you end up questioning a lot of things. But like so many things in life, often it leads you on a different path that you might not have chosen otherwise that ends up working out better. And for me in that situation, I ended up going into writing more and into journalism.
And that ended up being things like feature pieces for the Icelander magazine. It ended up being journalism within Reykjavik.
Yeah.
Were there particular areas that you felt were like your beat or your area of focus?
Well, in the end, in Iceland, my beat became the English language, right?
Okay.
So you end up writing about anything because I wrote in English. I always had a specific interest in travel writing, and I worked for this magazine called Iceland Review, which covered, it did profiles of people in Iceland but also destination pieces within the country. And as you mentioned, Icelander had an in-flight magazine at the time. I ended up editing it for a number of years. And then again, you would travel to Icelander destinations and write travel pieces, but I would also commission other pieces and sort of project manage that magazine too.
And then at a certain point, your husband becomes elected president of Iceland. And that means that you take on an unofficial, but it sounds like still fairly comprehensive role as First Lady of Iceland. Tell me about the duties that went along with that.
Well, yeah, and the whole story, it's a little bit, it's surreal in effect, but the long story short is that he chose to run for president 2 months before the election took place, and decided in the span of about a week, and had never run for public office before.
Hey, we just got one of those in Canada too.
Right.
It turns out it can happen.
It can happen. And so it was very sudden and unexpected. And then all of a sudden you're kind of known nationally as someone's wife. And I'm very proud to be his wife, but I wondered, it's not really my defining characteristic as a person. But you have this platform, as you say, and I'm the kind of person, if I buy a toaster or a kettle, I read the manual to make sure that I'm following the rules and I'm doing it the right way. And there is no rule book for how to be the spouse of a head of state. And yet there are all kinds of expectations, sort of these unofficial expectations. And I found that kind of intimidating first, because I wanted to do a good job. I was so honored and privileged to be able to serve. And I thought, but it's not like Mo Toaster. I can't figure out how to do this with someone telling me what's right and what's wrong. And so it takes a little while, but I knew always that I wanted to do something with it. And one of the important things for me was not to kind of perpetuate stereotypes that I think still exist about female spouses of male heads of state. We have obviously a huge majority of the heads of state around the world are men. A majority of them, I imagine, have female spouses. And there is some kind of an image that somehow these women, who are very often smart, educated, talented women in their own right, end up becoming reduced to some kind of muses for their husband's genius. And I don't mean that in a bad way to the husbands at all, but I thought, we still in the 21st century, we need to hear women's voices more, not less, regardless of what their role is. And I thought maybe this is an opportunity for me, as someone who is in an unelected position, but with a platform, to speak up about issues that I think are important, And in doing so, remind people that we don't need to leave it up to the elected officials. We don't need to just leave things up to politicians or other people that we think for some reason have more right to speak up than we do. That we all have some kind of an obligation to sort of nudge things in the right direction.
And so your career then, for many years, you had the duty of being First Lady. You had your work as a writer, as an editor, as a journalist, a mother of four, all of which I think are fairly comprehensive full-time jobs. When did you decide, let's also add the writing of a couple of books on top of
Yeah,
that?
exactly. Well, I do drink a lot of coffee. It's true. And it was always important to me, even from the outset, to keep my work, for instance, doing the writing. I also run a writers' conference called the Iceland Writers Retreat. And I thought, why should I quit my job? Because my husband got a new job, you know. And that was an important state for me. But I did a lot as First Lady. I delivered many, many speeches and went on many trips, solo trips and official visits with my husband. And the book idea came about during the pandemic when everything shifted, as we all know. And it's indicative, I suppose, of my privilege too, that for a First Lady, there was less to do, frankly. And in Iceland, the schools, even our four children were in primary school, they still had in-person education all the time at staggered times. And so we weren't kind of doing our own homeschooling, but I was walking the kids to and from school a lot. And when you walk, you get these ideas. And that's where I had the idea for my first book, Secrets of the Sprakar. And the second book I started to write kind of as soon as I finished the first one, because I think a huge impediment to people who are interested in becoming published writers is actually finding the time to sit down and write the book.
The first book is nonfiction, The Secrets of the Sprakar. Tell me about how that book came about. Were there some particular things that you experienced or noticed that made you decide you wanted to pull all of this together?
Well, the spark for the idea was actually the fact that in April 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, Vigdís Finnbogadóttir, who is a former president of Iceland, she is the world's first democratically elected female head of state. So Iceland had this female president for 16 years growing up, and she turned 90 in April 2020. She turned 95 in April this year. And people, of course, in Iceland were celebrating this. She's a huge icon in Iceland. And I remember thinking, I don't know that many people outside of the Nordic region really remember Vigdís that well or know her story all that well. And it's an important story. And it reminded me as well that, Iceland is the closest country in the world to closing the gender gap. And this idea of the fight for gender equality and why that's something that's important for people of all genders was a sort of very huge interest area of mine. And so the spark was Vigdís's idea, and I thought I should write kind of a love letter to my adopted homeland told through the eyes of its women, to explain to other countries what is it like to be a woman in, quote unquote, the world's best country for women. What is good about it? What can we be doing better? And so it's not a history of the country. It's not a policy document about feminism, but I hope it's an inspiring story of hearing diverse tales of regular people in the country. Not the most famous people, not necessarily activists or self-described feminists, but people just talking about their lives. Because I think when we hear about these other lives in maybe locations different from ours or on the surface stories that are different from ours, we also realize what connects us more. And I hope that kind of brings us closer together.
In a way, it felt to me almost like a how-to book for any country that wanted to truly organize itself around gender equality. You cover parental leave and childcare, depictions of women in the historical sagas of Iceland, LGBTQ rights, women CEOs. Each chapter is just another revelation in the ways that Iceland has been able to achieve this. And it just feels like it should be handed out to heads of states.
Well, I hope so. Maybe some will be listening.
We should probably just define what the Sprakar means.
Yes, that's a very good point. Sprakar is an old Icelandic word, which you may have guessed because it's not an English word, and it means extraordinary women. It's the plural of the singular word spraki, which means extraordinary woman. And it's actually quite an obscure old word. And when I was writing the book, I wanted to find an Icelandic word that I could use in the title that I thought might be interesting. And the Icelandic word for woman is kona, K-O-N-A, which I thought was a bit drab. And the Icelandic word for equality is jafnrétti, which is spelled Jafnre. And I thought, well, that's not going to...
So good on the search.
No,
on the website.
Really not great. And then another friend of mine discovered this word Sprakar, which I loved, but it hadn't. We have a database in Iceland that you can search when words are used in documents, and it hadn't been used, quote unquote, publicly or in printed materials in over 100 years, I think.
So this isn't something that someone would just call you.
No,
as you were.
no,
Okay.
people. It's not a word that anyone knew, and my husband didn't know it. My mother-in-law, who taught Icelandic, didn't know it, and I ended up calling the head of an institute for Icelandic language. Because I thought, I'm the First Lady and I'm not a woman of foreign origin. And if I get this wrong, I'll be lambasted. And she hadn't heard of the word either. And then I started getting nervous. But then she looked it up. And, Icelanders are really proud of the Icelandic language. And she said, no, and it kind of fits. It's actually really good. So now if you hear it, it probably has come from the book. It's given it a bit of a renaissance.
So you get bonus points for reviving an
Right?
old word,
Yeah.
not just for using one correctly.
Exactly.
You also, in the book, in addition to just doing an amazing job of showing the different ways from a policy perspective, lifestyle perspective, Icelanders have created an environment of equality. You also talk about some of the challenges faced by women, especially women who immigrate to Iceland. And you asked one person to describe their first day or their first memory as a new immigrant to Iceland. And I'm wondering if you could do the same for us. Is there an early memory that you have arriving there that encapsulates that experience of being there for the first time?
Well, it's interesting you say this too, because one of the things I say, I have a chapter on immigration and people who move to the country, because it's an increasingly diverse country, and that's changed very rapidly even since I moved. And one of the things I also say is that there's no cookie cutter immigrant. Everyone has different reasons and backgrounds and motivations, and I kind of say for the Icelandic audience as well, to remind us that we shouldn't all be put in the same block. So for me, the first thing I really remember the first time I went to Iceland was the fresh air, coming out of the airport and even in an airport parking lot, breathing in the fresh air and thinking that it was wonderful. And I fall really into the most privileged category of image of the country, because I'm, a white, heterosexual, able-bodied cis woman who is married to a local person and whose English is my first language, and I'm well educated. And so, and nevertheless, of course, I still had different challenges moving to the country. I tell a story in the book at the beginning about seeing a woman breastfeeding her baby in my company when I started, and I was in my 20s and hadn't thought about having kids at all yet. And I thought, wow, well, this is very good when nobody cares if you're just nursing a child while you're, chairing a board meeting of a software company. And, I think that is a good example of the sort of openness of the society. I remember that. And I did keep a diary, not daily, but fairly regularly when I moved. And I think anyone who's moved countries knows that you go through these phases where you think I wrote for a page on how amazing a sunset was and just thought this was beautiful. And then the next day, everything is awful. And I mean, to reread it too, I sound so incredibly spoiled, and I'm frustrated that I can't find like sour cream in the stores, and woe is me.
That passage that you describe of watching the chair of the board of a software company nursing a baby in the meeting was also interesting, because it speaks to just how small the community of Iceland is, because not only was that a person you kept in touch with, but also the person who ran against your husband in the election.
Yes, and came in second. And because this book came out a few years ago, and it was close. And then she's now president, because when my husband decided not to run again, she ran again and won. So these kind of things happen in Iceland all the time. We know each other through many different degrees of separation.
You mentioned that moving from nonfiction to fiction was something that just happened. There wasn't a big gap in between. Tell me a bit about kind of the genesis of Death on the Island. Yeah.
Well, there was, I guess, two reasons that I moved to it. One was almost a professional challenge, that I finished Secrets of the Sprakar, and I thought, I want to say I like writing. I more like having written than the actual current process of writing.
I think a lot of people feel
Yeah.
that.
But I thought, if I don't start another book now, I'll always say that I'm too busy. And then I thought, well, maybe I should try writing fiction because it will be more challenging for me. I've never written fiction before. And I love murder mysteries. So to me, if I was going to write something fiction, that was going to be the type of book that I wrote because of the type of books that I like to read. And then I had to really create a world. And to me, there was no question that I would write an Iceland set mystery because I know the country and I know how to explain it from an outsider's perspective. Mm-hmm. But that outsider's perspective is obviously that of a Canadian. And so I knew I would have to have a Canadian protagonist. And so there was a lot of these practical, it's like writing a manual to something, a lot of these practical things that I thought of first. And I just thought it was an interesting to center it around like this diplomatic world, not to write an international spy thriller where they're sort of hopping around the planet, but something set that it showed a little bit the nuanced work and the important work that diplomats do, but that's a bit sexier than I lost my passport,
right.
And I thought it provided a good opportunity for murder because in this world of diplomacy, there's a lot of there's official things on the surface that you have to be doing, and then there's a whole lot underneath the surface that you need to, relationships that you need to be nurturing, contacts that you need to be building, bridges that might need mending, and there's a lot of, in some sense, a secrecy about it. And I thought that was quite an intriguing thing to discuss, especially in this this landscape of Iceland, which really lends itself to dark and spooky books.
Well, this whole genre of Nordic noir, it took hold of the crime fiction genre like many years ago now. And there's loads of speculation about why people in the North are so skilled at writing about murder. But getting to talk to you means I get to probe this issue much more scientifically because you moved to Iceland as an adult. So it's not like there's something in the water. But did you say you always, you loved crime as a genre, but I'm interested if moving to Iceland sort of exposed you to, factors that would darken the soul of anyone who lives there long enough.
Not necessarily. I think the landscape is the main thing there. That's the inspiration. And of course, I've read more Icelandic crime fiction authors now, obviously, and there have been so many more who have been published in English now since I've been living there for over 20 years. I would say the Nordic noir or the Icelandic noir genre, even on its own, is a little darker than what I've written. It's a little bit more, sometimes violent, but just bleaker, I would say.
And both psychologically and...
Yeah. And the style of what I've written, I would call a little bit more of a kind of classic golden age sort of British style mystery where you meet the characters at the beginning. And of course, I hope that I've created kind of multifaceted, flawed, complex characters as well. But a little bit less maybe sort of hopeless in everything, so that I hope that it's a page turner that the reader wants to read more, but I think they'll still be able to sleep at night.
And it's in a way like a locked room mystery, except that the locked room is an island off of the coast of Iceland. Exactly.
And it's one of these area called the Westman Islands or Vestmannaeyjar in Icelandic, which is the word that I use in the book. And it's a less visited part of the country, maybe because you have to take a ferry ride or a flight to be able to get there. But for visitors, it's fascinating. They had a volcanic eruption there suddenly 50 years ago, and now there's a museum there that's built where they excavated one of the homes that had been covered by ash, and you can visit a museum. There's a beluga whale sanctuary there. There's a wonderful swimming pool. So it's a really interesting region of the country for visitors, and also in this small area, there's all these different things to see. And again, to bring diplomats over who need to see culture and business and history, it also provided an opportunity to see all of that in a small space.
And you're right. It doesn't, although it is isolated, it's a small island in the middle of the Atlantic, you don't get that sense of environment as oppressor or environment as its own sort of threatening character. I interviewed Anne Cleves a few years ago when she was describing how she started writing mysteries set in the Shetland Islands. And she had followed her husband there to study birds. And I'm paraphrasing, but she basically said, after 6 months of looking at birds, you do start to think about killing someone.
That's a wonderful line, though.
And And yet, I didn't get that sense here, that this was not
No.
like, you will kind of be driven to crime. It actually seems, very nice.
Yeah.
Death on the Island sets a number of characters in motion, all moving against each other. They're intersecting, they're colliding. In some cases, they're dying. Tell us where we are at the beginning of the book and set the stage for us a little bit.
Right. Well, there is a 2-page prologue where a man discovers the body of his husband. And we don't know exactly who these people are, and he has died. Setting that prologue aside, because it's only 2 pages, we start at a dinner. And the dinner really introduces us to all the characters. So it's maybe a bit of heavy lifting at the beginning for the reader, because you get all the characters at once and then you get them sorted out. And we have this Canadian delegation who are making an official visit to the Westman Islands. So the Canadian delegation is comprised of the Canadian ambassador to Iceland and his wife, and the deputy ambassador to Iceland and her husband. And in real life, spoiler, there is no deputy ambassador in Iceland. It's a small mission. Also, a Canadian writer of Icelandic descent, and a Canadian artist who has an exhibition that's opening on the islands that the ambassador is going to open. And then on the Icelandic side is the mayor of the Westman Islands, as well as a leading sort of fishing magnate, someone who's become quite wealthy through the fishing industry, and his wife. And the chef that's cooking the meal is also one of the characters. So these are all the people that you meet at a dinner, and there's a lot of tensions at this dinner. The protagonist, Jane, who is the wife of the Canadian ambassador, is generally frustrated with a lot of things, not least her marriage, but also what's been going on that day. And we kind of feel and see this tension a little bit. And then after dinner, someone dies. Bum, bum, bum.
And as you say, the beginning of the book is an especially fraught dinner party. Mm-hmm. Is it safe to say that you have attended more than a few dinners like this in your own official capacity?
It's interesting because I'm being asked this increasingly, and I have attended many, many dinners in an official capacity that are very formal in this sense, with different seating arrangements. People are mixed together. There may or may not be a certain objective. You're going through course after course of this really nice food. But I quite enjoyed them all, I have to say. There were none where I was thinking, when will this be done? And why is this person looking at that person? And that's one of the dimensions of the role that I really, really enjoyed, is the opportunity to go to lots of different places and meet lots of different people. And I like eating, I confess. And maybe that might come through a little bit in the book, because I do focus a lot on the food. So I can't think of any fraught dinner parties in that sense, but definitely in terms of the structure and how it's going and how the schedule is, absolutely.
You talk in your first book about small country syndrome, and how we get excited when you live in a small country about seeing your own country showing up in books, media, sports, anything. Yeah. So my version of small country syndrome is getting all excited whenever there are Canadians in books, and you have several of them. They're all over the place in this one. And so how does it feel as an author when you're writing for an international audience to drop Canadians into a book?
To me, it was just the voice that I knew how to write a little bit. Even as a subset within that, one of the characters is, as I mentioned, a Canadian of Icelandic descent who's from Gimli, Manitoba. And Gimli is the community where the settlement of New Iceland, as it was called, where many Icelanders, when they fled Iceland and sort of from the late 19th century, early 20th century, went to Gimli. And there's a strong Icelandic connection to this day in the community there, but I think outside of that community, people don't necessarily know that, and so that's a kind of little inside baseball joke there to this Canadian character. But nobody has said to me, I have obviously an American publisher too, or things, and they've never said, oh, can this be any different? And the book has also been optioned for television, and it will be a Canadian Icelandic co-production, which is really exciting. And again, I love the idea of having those, two nations cooperate, do filming together. I would love it if, say, the Icelandic characters are speaking Icelandic together when there's no Canadians around, and vice versa, and you get a really kind of international production. We'll see how it goes.
We learn a lot as well about the careers of diplomats, how they progress, what can hold them back, what a win looks like if you're an ambassador. it felt like there was some research there, or at least some friendly conversations with people in that life.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I mean, so I actually have a degree in international relations, which is something that a lot of people then go into the foreign service after studying that subject. And it is a bit of an homage to the diplomatic service, because I think it's this career that in many senses hasn't changed over hundreds of years. And it can be tough to be a diplomat, to be moving countries every few years and kind of setting up everything that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation about new languages, new people, new cultures. And they do this for their whole professional careers with their families in tow all the time, and to varying degrees of comfort in the other countries. And so it's a bit of an homage to what they do. And I, of course, was very exposed to that when I was First Lady, and I have a number of friends who are diplomats. So I did try to speak to them a lot about what was going on and how it happened. And as you said, like anywhere else, diplomatic services have a whole range of personalities and ages and interests and ambitions. And I tried to capture that as well in the book. But it does lend itself a little bit to sort of, as I said, two-facedness or planning other things.
And lots of underlying agendas and objectives that aren't said out loud. But it also speaks to, again, with small countries, in the diplomatic service, there are big countries to get posted to, and there are little countries to get posted to. And Iceland being, not a place that you would reach at the pinnacle of your career, but maybe one that you could progress from.
Right. And the Canadian ambassador in this situation is really somebody who's kind of plateaued in his career. He is more ambitious than this, but it hasn't quite been working for him. And I feel a little bit like he's sort of been coasting on his privilege. He's and maybe there isn't quite as much there that would really let him rise to the top, but he kind of wishes that he could. And, again, Iceland, in real life, it's quite a small embassy, the mission there, and the diplomatic community is quite small. But Iceland is a great place to live in the sense that it's a, high income, safe country. It's not so far from Canada for people to go back home. So, there are pluses and minuses, I guess, there, like everywhere else. But you are kind of a bigger fish in the pond when you're in Iceland, too. So that's intriguing.
This is a book where you're seeing the story from many different perspectives. The person who takes up the task of figuring out who killed the deputy ambassador is Jane Shearer, the wife of the prime suspect, Graham Shearer, boss of the victim, ambassador from Canada. Tell me a bit more about her. She has a lot of emotions, a lot of motivations pulling her in different directions, even as we start the book, but as it starts to gain speed.
Well, she's, and again, I tried to develop a sort of complex and realistic character there. She's someone who I think, this is how I envisaged her, at least. I don't even know how much of it I explore in the book itself, but someone who had, not a great upbringing, sort of a troubled, wild upbringing, and then at university met Graham, who became her husband, who really represented this kind of stability. And at that young age, that was very appealing to her, that he really represented, I don't necessarily mean the establishment as in sort of like huge upper class privilege, but that's that sort of thing. And they get married quite young, have twins quite young. But then she also realizes that she's spent her own adult life just following him from place to place. And she doesn't necessarily love that quite restricted lifestyle, and she's starting to resent it a little bit. And she's also angry at herself for not speaking up about that. So this is, and when her husband becomes the prime suspect, she doesn't believe that he is guilty of this, but it's also almost for her own kind of intellectual challenge and for feeling needed that she's pursuing it, almost rather than clearing her husband's name.
and she knows him as a guy who has secrets.
Yes,
and,
absolutely.
And
absolutely.
so that always is like kind of in the back of her head at all times.
Definitely. And then her own weaknesses with respect to that. And so without wanting to go into too much detail about it, I think it's her feelings are a little conflicted.
We also get a view into the economics and the environments of small towns, the one big employer, whether it's the fish plant or the factory or the business, and its outsized impact on the life of a community. I've lived in towns that have definitely had that feel. Is that a dramatic device, or is that something that you were seeing kind of repeated through your time in Iceland?
That's a great question. I think that's actually, I think it's a useful dramatic device, but it is true in Iceland. Iceland has many smaller communities in which, especially the communities on the coastline, where these fish facilities that are processing fish and also have a number of fishing vessels that are actually going and doing the fishing, they really have an outsized impact on the economy of a community. And if that were to close, it would have a devastating impact on the community. And that, again, can be used as a good dramatic tool. In the case of the Westman Islands, in real life, again, there is a fish processing facility there, but it's a different situation. It's a more the community is kind of more diverse and widespread and stable than what I imply in the book.
More generally, Death on the Island draws on themes of locals versus outsiders, natives versus immigrants, the secrets that are held in small towns. And I just have to ask, was this a way to work through some of the feelings that you had as you were learning how to live and work in Iceland and getting to know the fabric of the country?
That's a good question. I don't think so, really. Or I didn't think about it too much. I definitely thought about it in the sense of writing about a country I know well but didn't grow up in.
Okay.
So certainly in that sense, less so in terms of examining different things, maybe because I've also lived there for over 20 years. So in that sense, I feel like probably I've worked through a lot of that stuff, or I hope so. But that was really why I came across that, perspective.
We talked a bit earlier about small country syndrome, that hypervigilance for your own country in the media, winning in sports, medal tallies at the Olympics. Yeah. What I especially love is Iceland's ability to win almost any competition that is based on per capita measurements.
True.
My favorites are swimming pools per capita and maybe chess grandmasters per capita. But I have to ask what your favorite is in that.
So I have often used, and it turns out it's wrong, most Nobel Prize winners per capita, because we have a Nobel Prize winner in literature, Hildur Laxness. And then, again, when you think that you're bragging about something, someone will come along and put you in your place, right? Yep. The Faroe Islands have a Nobel Prize winner in physics. And then I thought, well, physics. So we'll just say most Nobel Prize winners in literature.
Okay.
St. Lucia has a Nobel Prize winner in literature. So, but if we get one more, then we'll be like ahead forever, right?
Yes.
My husband, when I first knew him, he used to talk about, we have, Europe's longest river per capita. And I always found that a little bit dubious, the sort of geographical achievements. I'm a little skeptical about
I had also heard published poets per capita.
Oh, that could be true.
I think that was the other one that I'd heard as well.
That could be true. That's a good one.
That just kind of felt deep to my heart.
There's also a lot of hot dog consumption. I wonder if there's a per capita statistic.
I also look at both of these books as being so interesting as Canada reevaluates its place in the world, not just as the northern country in North America, but as a country of the North, as a country that has a lot in common with other Arctic countries and are maybe slowly starting to let that into our consciousness. I'm just interested in you, if you have any thoughts on that as someone who has a foot in both cultures.
I love this question, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately as well. May not surprise you. Yeah. Setting aside even the whole literature debate, I have always thought that Canada and the Nordics, broadly speaking, could strengthen their relationships. The Canadian population and the population of the Nordics combined is very, very similar. And we are these sort of socially small L liberal countries, with, I would say, broadly similar social values in terms of sustainability and equality and diversity. And we are countries of the North where we know that nature rules. And of course, we have our own challenges and unique approaches. But this is a world now where I think that friends need to stand together and work together. Diplomats play an important role in that, if I'm tying it somehow back to my book. And I think that we should be doing as much as we can to celebrate those connections. And it's something that I try to do a lot in Iceland, to be talking a lot more about Canada. I've been doing a lot of media interviews in Iceland, talking about what's going on in Canada these days, and just helping people to be made aware of that. And if there's anything, to reemphasize that I learned serving as First Lady, it's reminding us that we all have a voice, and maybe we all have a different platform or mic from which we can speak, but we do all have voices. We do all have an influence in our communities in some sort of an area. And I strongly believe that we have an obligation to use those voices to have a positive impact on society in some form or another. And I think storytelling is a really important way to do that. It's a way where we can build these connections with each other, with communities or peoples that we might think on the surface are different from ours, and that help bring out and show us how we are actually a lot more similar. And, serving as First Lady made me more of an optimist, which sounds possibly ridiculous, but I did have this opportunity to travel all around the country in different places, and really, I have more faith in humanity from it, because most people are good people, and most people are trying to do good things, and they're putting their heart and soul into passion projects all over the place. And I feel incredibly privileged that I got to witness that, but also to remind people to speak up that is what most people are like. We just need to keep saying that, and to keep meeting each other and talking to each other, and understanding that most of us really want this better world for each other. So let's all do our bit to make that happen.
I can't think of a better place to stop than right there. Eliza, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I've been speaking with Eliza Reid, author of Death on the Island. Find it and Secrets of the Spekar at kobo.com/conversation. There's a link in the show notes. Follow the show from wherever you're listening. And if you enjoyed this one, tell someone who you'd clear of a murder charge, whether you're married to them or not. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamblyn. Thank you for listening.